or at 6 p.m. to remind me to like leave.
Yeah, that's funny. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us today for another session of the Data and AI Architecture Group. Today we have the introduction to MM Power Query from Eugene Meidinger. Thank you, Eugene, for volunteering your time for the group. We are really excited for the session today. We got quite a bit of people already jumping in, so I think a lot of people are really interested in the topic as well. So without further ado, take it away, Eugene. Once again, thank you. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions, and yeah, let's rock and roll. Oh, I can't hear your audio right now, Eugene.
Oh, yeah, I have
There we
myself
go.
muted. My bad.
You're
Let's
back.
try this
All right,
again. All
no
right.
worries.
Yeah, so please type any questions you have in the chat. Warner will interrupt me. This is a talk that I've redone. And so it's going to be a bit on the shorter side because originally it was an hour-long presentation, and then I redid it as a 20-minute lightning talk for SQL bits, and then I'm expanding it back out to an hour. So what that's going to mean is, one, please, if you have any questions at all, that's gonna help me with time. But then also I'll probably have more demos and more just playing around and showing you the tooling than I normally would. So please feel free to ask questions. Also, my understanding is, this is more of a cloudy kind of audience. So if you've never heard of Power Query or have no idea how it works, perfectly fine. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. Oh, so real quick about me. I am a Power BI consultant. So people pay me to help them deploy, set up Power BI, make reports. I'm currently specializing in performance tuning for Power BI, and no one has asked for a refund yet. So I assume that means I'm doing something well, right? I'm a video training author, so I have about a dozen courses on Pluralsight, about 8 of them on Power BI. And then sorry, my glasses are killing me. And then I've got one course I just started on Teachable. So 2 out of the 7 modules are out for that, and that's on Power BI performance tuning. And then finally, I'm a Microsoft MVP, which means that I do things like this and I try to help the community. But enough about me. You didn't come to learn about me. What are we going to talk about? So the very, very first thing is, when should I use Power Query? Before you even need to know the details of what it is and how it works, let's just set very quickly in a slide or so of, should you use it? One of the things that's particularly frustrating when it comes to a lot of Microsoft tooling in general, honestly, is there's kind of this implication that this new tool is going to solve everything. All right, we've created Azure Spork, and it's exactly what you need for exactly your problem. And I think both as like practitioners and presenters and technologists, we'd all would do a little bit better kind of acknowledging that a lot of these tools are domain-specific languages, if you want to be technical, or very specialist tools. And when it comes to Power Query and when it comes to DAX, they are specialist tools. Um, they serve a niche purpose and are much more of a scalpel than they are a Swiss Army knife. Even though when I talk about it, it's going to look like Power Query is a Swiss Army knife. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about, is like, when should we even use it? Because there's a lot of cases where you really shouldn't. Next, going to talk about what is Power Query. I'm going to kind of define it as a couple high-level things and show you some of the functionality. I'm going to talk about what Power Query is not, and then we'll play around with the AdventureWorks database, show you some of the features, and just give you a general idea. Again, if at any point you have any questions, please feel free to type those in the chat and Warner will interrupt and we'll get those answered. So when should I use it? When should I use Power Query? So the first thing is behind Power Query is the M language. And I like to joke that if you could pay someone to do the work for minimum wage, like menial labor in Excel, then the M language can automate it for you. And even though that's a joke, I find that to be very good for expectation setting. Um, I would not set up an enterprise data pipeline in Excel, right? I would not do enterprise level data transformations in Excel, but I would do VLOOKUPs, right? Or I would do split some text or replace or like a simple quantity times price kind of calculation. Um, and so this is a very helpful grounding because the official litmus test for Power Query, when it was made, is it was designed for users who get value from the Excel formula bar. This I'm gonna get the name wrong. This was said, I think, by Matt Mason, who was one of the PMs ages ago, back in like 2014. Um, and this is the grounding that you should have because if you are attending this user group, Power Query was not meant for you, most likely, right? Power Query is very much designed for people who have no real support from IT. They have to do self-service. And the thing to understand is that sometimes we do self-service out of necessity, not out of skill. For example, during the pandemic, I did a lot of self-service haircuts. I counted the length of the pandemic by how many I did. I think I made it to 3. Um, I have no intention of ever doing another self-service haircut, right? But because I did not have any support by professionals, um, I kind of had no choice, right? And that's how I feel about Power Query half the time. Half the time, to me, it's okay, you're forced to combine data from CSV files and Excel and Access and SQL. You're on your own. Your idea of a data lake is OneDrive or a SharePoint document library, and you need to make the most of it. On the other hand, um, I see Power Query as this sort of democratizing kind of tool where it's very intuitive, it's very easy to use, or at least very easy to get started. We'll talk about some of the challenges. Um, and so it is my favorite ETL tool. No lie, no joke, 100% sincere, right? And part of that is because you can step through each step and see what the data looks like. There's a button for everything. And so I'm a big fan of it, but I have to understand that it's not meant for me. Um, and that really, that understanding would have helped a lot with some of the initial frustration that I ran into when I was first learning Power BI in like 2016. Finally, related to that, if your data lives in SQL or a structured lakehouse or something like that, you only need half of the features, right? There's so many features that are designed to deal with the fact that if you have a CSV file and you have a date column and it says 0201 2024, right? Well, if you're a dumb American like me, we've decided that means February 1st. If you're the rest of the world, they've decided that that means January 2nd, right? And so you need tooling to handle those things because CSV files don't provide any structure. And heaven forbid that you're sending CSV files to the Germans because their comma separated value files are delimited by semicolons. Don't ask me why. I don't know why they don't change the name to SSV. I don't question it, right? But when your data is in SQL, you've got data types, you've got structure. You don't need to do a lot of these conversions. You don't need to promote headers. So there's a bunch of features that assume that some amount of your data is coming from unstructured or semi-structured flat files. So that's the kind of gist of whether you should use it. So what is it, right? Now that you've decided, okay, I'm going to go back to eating my lunch or I'm going to listen to the rest of this, what is Power Query. So let's talk a little bit about the history. As I kind of hinted at, Power Query is a business-friendly data transformation tool. That's the way that I like to think about it. And originally, back in like 2010 era, it started as an Excel add-in. So back in the day, there were 4 Excel add-ins with the word power in the name. Someone in marketing decided that power sounded good, so you had Power Query for data transformations, Power View for data modeling, not Power View, sorry, Power Pivot for data modeling, Power View for rendering in Silverlight, which is very dead now, and then Power Maps for 3D maps, but we don't talk about that, right? And so this genealogy is important again because the shape of the tool um, shapes how you use it, right? And this was very much designed for business users. Later, 2015 era, it was combined with Power Pivot and some HTML-based web rendering to make Power BI as we know it today. And so they just took 3 of these different products, shoved them all together, and called it something new. And if you've been keeping up with Fabric, that may sound familiar, right? But now it's in Fabric as data flows. And again, I can probably show you a quick demo depending on time. And so it's changed over time, but the core functionality, the core language, the core UI has stayed the same the entire time. So what is it? Well, there's 3 things I like to think about. One is that it's a toolkit, right? It's all these different things, all these different transformations that you can do to your data. It is very much focused on, okay, what is the transformation I can take? It's not like SSIS or Azure data flows where it's much more about some of the flows and logic. There's not a, okay, if successful, go here, if error, go here kind of thing. It's just, okay, I want to add rows, I want to pivot, I want to rename, yada, 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 right? It's a bunch of tools that have been put together. And so some of the work is finding the tool. It is a no code solution. So you can write all of your Power Query by just clicking buttons. Again, because it's designed for business users. Um, and so you can make use of it with just the UI, never having to write any code, not having to have any programming experience. And then finally, it's a series of linear transformations. Again, if you've worked with SSIS or Azure Data Factory, you might be used to this kind of branching kind of approach or kind of, I remember with SSIS, the days of like the kind of head node that managed the whole thing and then ran a bunch of sub packages. You're not going to see that. Instead, what you're going to see is something like this, right? So here's the Power Query editor. It's a little bit clipped off at the top, but the idea is that over on the right is the applied steps, and it goes step by step by step, transformation by transformation by transformation, and in the middle you can see what the data looks like at any given point. But the most important thing that Power Query is Power Query is a lie. Everything that I just told you is a little white lie from Microsoft. And so let's kind of walk through that because it can be a little bit misleading when you're trying to reconcile the marketing with the lived experience, right? So toolkit. Toolkit kind of implies that it's organized and you've got like all your different drill bits and all your different wrenches. And in reality, it's much more of a junk drawer. So I don't know if any of you grew up with the junk drawer or know what a junk drawer is, but I grew up with my parents from the Great Depression, or grandparents from the Great Depression, and so they never threw anything away. And so here's my childhood junk drawer. We have 2 marbles there. We have a binky, even though I don't remember ever seeing a baby around. Maybe I just blocked it out. I don't know why we had a CD in there. That's not the best place for one. Had a sealed baseball card. Just this was the junk drawer. And when it comes to learning Power Query, this is honestly the hardest part, as silly as it sounds, is you look at this UI. So this is one of the ribbons for Power Query. You'll notice that we've got home, transform, add column view, all this kind of stuff. And it can be a little bit overwhelming. And I feel bad for the original developers because they had to figure out kind of a taxonomy of all these different things that you could do, and they're just so unrelated. Again, this is an amazing replacement for stuff that you would pay an intern to do in Excel by hand. But if I were to try to make a taxonomy and group some of these transformations together, the first thing most often that I'm dealing with is combining data. That's one of the first things that I'm doing is I'm merging, I'm appending, I'm joining things together. I'm taking multiple tables or multiple files because in some cases you've got these weekly extracts and I'm combining them together. I'm not worrying about relationships like I will be in DAX. I'm not worrying about the long term, like, okay, this header relates to this line item. It's much more of the general kind of reshaping. So it's much more like if you were to take a view in SQL and you were to join two tables to make it look like a single flat table, right? Next is modifying columns. So it's very, very common to split a column based on some sort of delimiter. Usually I'm getting rid of stuff that I don't need because that's going to impact compression and performance down the road. The more columns you have in DAX and Power BI, the worse your compression. Um, One of the other ones there, fill values down. If you're dealing with CSV files, if your Excel file looks more like an art canvas than it does a normalized table, then you may have to fill in some of the blanks. Modifying rows. So again, CSVs, it's very common to say, oh, this first row is a header. Or in Excel, you may have rows that are more decorative or what have you. There's a lot of support for string manipulation, and then there's just a bunch of other kind of stuff. And so very often when it comes to Power Query, the most difficult part is finding the button. It's not hard to use if you know where the button is. Um, but it can be a little bit overwhelming if you're brand new to it. So the next thing is technically it's no code, but really it's no, there's code, right? You just may not see it. So when you are working with Power Query, every time you click on a button, another applied step will show up. And at no point do you particularly see much in the way of code. You'll see a formula bar, and in theory, you can make changes similar like with Excel, but generally a lot of that's hidden from you. But behind the scenes, every single one of these steps corresponds to a line of code. And so this also can be kind of intimidating because I joke that the M language looks like someone took those alphabet magnets that you put on the fridge and then got rid of all the letters and just jumbled it up, right? There's a lot of punctuation in this syntax, and it's not bad once you understand what's going on. When you understand that each of these lines corresponds to a transformation and that it actually references the previous ones. But again, it can be a lot to take in at first. So Power Query is very much this weird sort of thing where at first it looks very approachable, and then it looks really intimidating, and then it's pretty approachable again, right? The other thing to understand is that in my experience, because they've optimized so heavily for the no code experience, because they've optimized so heavily for business users, you very much have the kind of Pareto rule, 80-20 rule. 80% of what you ever want to do in Power Query, there's a button for it. Once you find it, you're done, right? Super easy. That other 20% of what you might ever need to do is a nightmare because suddenly you're Googling some blog post about how to have the index reset based on groupings, right? Or you're trying to look up how to make a date table from scratch or whatever. And so suddenly you're just like the trapdoor falls and you're just plummeting into this land of code where for so long you didn't have to deal with it. The third thing is the idea that it's a bunch of linear transformations. That's the way that the UI presents it to you. And first off, that's not entirely true. So you can have steps that reference other steps. You can have forking. The UI just doesn't really show that well. The other thing is that that's not true at all. Power Query, or specifically the M language behind it, is a lazy programming language. So it's only going to do what it needs to do. And even if you tell it what to do, it may ignore you, right? So you might think of it as a helpful but somewhat rebellious teenager or what have you. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that you have a recipe for making brownies, and you say, Power Query, follow this recipe step by step. I see in the UI all these steps I've given you. I want you to do them in order. I want you to do them exactly as prescribed, right? That would be a procedural language, right? But in reality, M is a declarative language. We tell it where we want it to go, and it'll figure out how to get there. So if you were to give this recipe to Power Query, assuming it could cook, maybe in the future it can, it would say, well, I see all these steps. I respect you, but we never end up using the asparagus that you had me chop. So I'm just going to get rid of that step. We don't need it. And so uh, you say, okay, well, I guess that makes sense, right? If you do some sort of transformation, like you make a new column, and then you remove it at the very last step, it will never do that work. If you remove columns, it'll never call the SQL source to get that information, right? So out of the box, Power Query is fairly performant because it will avoid work it doesn't need to do, but it's even lazier than that because if you're Power Query, you might say, seven steps is a lot of steps. Do I really need to be doing all this? And so really what it's going to do is it's just going to buy some brownie mix and it's going to ignore a bunch of these steps. And so the brownie mix in this case is query folding. It's pushing the work back to the source engine. And so this is completely dependent on what your source engine is and if it supports query folding, right? So it's 100% dependent on the developers of the connector. And the way that you can generally tell is you can go to a step, you can right click and you can say view native query. And if it's bolded, if it's black, then you can take a look and see what query it's sending to the source system. Now that if it's grayed out, that's a likely sign that you've broken query folding, but not a guarantee. So the only way to be 100% sure would be to run a trace on the source system. But generally speaking, you want to have any steps that look like they're breaking query folding to be last, so that stuff like filtering certain calculations. So here we can see, let me see if I can, little laser line or something. So, so here we can see that we have some filtering that's been pushed down, as well as logic for our line total is being pushed down to the server. And so you want to have those kinds of steps first, and then anything that might break query folding. So, for example, as far as I'm aware, Power Query has a transformation called like sentence case that SQL Server doesn't. And so that's not going to be supported in SQL Server, so that's going to break query folding. You want to have those things later on. But generally, it's pretty good about this stuff. So, just to kind of summarize, and then we'll do some demos, and I'm happy to answer any questions. What is Power Query actually? So it is very much a junk drawer of common transformations that you're going to run into if you're dealing with data that's in CSV files, Excel files, SQL, and it's very hard to categorize and organize all of these different transformations because there's so many and they're so varied. Um, And that's probably the most difficult thing when learning how to use Power Query. Next, there's code. Even if you never see it, you never touch it, there's code. For me personally, most of the time I don't have to drop down into the code. Sometimes I will because it's quicker or the UI doesn't support what I want. For example, if you do remove columns, there's no UI to change it, but if you do remove other columns, there is. I don't know why. And then finally, it's lazy. So it's going to try to do things as efficiently as possible, which means it's going to ignore steps it doesn't need to do, and it's going to push back as many steps to the source system, which makes a lot of sense because if you think about something like SQL Server is optimized for data retrieval, especially if you have secondary indexes or I don't know, just more CPU, whereas the server that's likely to be running Power Query is going to be underpowered. They're given a certain amount of RAM for container sizes, and in general, you're not going to have as much sort of horsepower as you would your source system, generally speaking. All right, so before we jump into demos, do we have any questions? Let's see. We've got people from Florida and Germany. No questions yet. I'll give people a minute or two, and then I guess I can close this now. Discard my ink annotations. All right, cool. So what I'm going to do is just kind of show you around when it comes to Power Query, show you how to see query folding and some of these other things, and show you Power Query and Fabric real quick and that kind of stuff. And again, if anybody has any questions at any point, more than happy to answer any of those. So let me get my microphone out of the way. So what we have here is Power BI. And what I've done is, hold on, let me confirm SQL Server is up. It usually is, but, okay, no, there we go. So what I've done is I've connected to the AdventureWorks database. And so I've got sales order detail, but the way that you're normally going to first interact is you might say get data. And one of the things that you'll see is that you're provided with a lot of potential data sources. One of the things to understand is that the quality of these data sources is widely varied. So if it's something from Microsoft, the quality is probably pretty good. Things like Postgres and MySQL tend to be pretty decent, but then you have a lot of stuff where it has, say, beta in the name. And I can tell you right now, QuickBooks has been in beta for years. It's never going to leave beta, right? And you can even write your own data sources. But in this case, we want to just go ahead and talk to SQL Server. So here I'm going to tell localhost, and we will do import mode, which is going to cache a copy of the data in our data model, whereas direct query would convert DAX straight to SQL. So here I want to go and grab sales order header. And I could load it as is, which with the AdventureWorks sample database would be just a terrible idea because there's all this kind of junk in there. So it's going to open up a different window, which can be kind of confusing because it's honestly its own little program kind of embedded in here. But as I kind of mentioned, you can see that we've got just all this stuff. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get rid of all this junk. One of the things that it does automatically is if we wanted to, we could automatically do kind of a join if we wanted to expand out and grab a salesperson, for example. But usually what I'm going to do with this sort of thing is I'm just control clicking here. I'm going to grab a couple columns that I care about, and then I want to get rid of most other things. Because again, it takes up space, it makes the compression worse, and we can see that in a second. So I can do remove other columns, and just as a quick example, let's see, we'll get rid of sales that don't have a purchase order. Yeah, so Sherry had a question: is using Power Query within Excel and Power BI the same process? 95% the same. There's some buttons and features you may not see. In Excel, it's usually lagging behind a little bit, and it's not as smooth sometimes, the way the UI is, but it's pretty much the same the way that you work with it. So now I can go to View Native Query. I can see that it's going to make some really weird SQL. So if you've worked with SQL Server, you'll notice that we've got it's like a little burrito. We've got our subquery wrapped in by another query. And one of the things to be aware of is I just wrapped up a performance tuning project where Postgres was the backend. And because of the complexity of the data model, we had some many-to-many relationships and a bunch of issues. Our little burrito, our SQL burrito, had like 6 layers. And I don't know the limit with SQL Server, but with Postgres, once it hit like those 6 layers, the query estimator just stopped estimating. So when we were looking at execution plans for what it thought it was going to return, it just gave up and said, probably 1 row. And it made some really bad choices, which mattered mostly because we were dealing with direct query. But I can go ahead and tell it close and apply. And so it's going to load the data in. And then it was able to infer that we have a relationship based on sales order ID. So Sherry's asking which is recommended. So the it's kind of an interesting question because it really depends on what you're trying to do. What's more important is whether you're using Excel or Power Query or Power BI as opposed to where to use Power Query. If you want the latest features for Power Query, then yes, you want to do it in Power BI. But generally speaking, it's much more of a question of, have you started using Power BI or are you heavily using Excel? So I wouldn't consider Power Query to be the deciding factor. Let me show you. Let's see. Do I have Bravo? I do. So to show you real quick about the compression kind of piece. So again, it's tempting to just bring in everything. Here I'm using Bravo, which is a free tool. There's other tools like DAX Studio. Um, but I just want to show you. So we can see the size here for the table. And so sales order detail is 789 kilobytes, which isn't really a ton. But I just want to bring in that same table, but without getting rid of any columns or anything, just to kind of show you the difference. So I'm just going to hit load. And so it's going to load it as is with just a bunch of junk. It's also going to try to help with the relationships. And as you can see, it's marked one of them as inactive because you can't have any sort of loops. So let me see. Can I refresh? Here we go. Okay. So we can see that sales order detail 2 is taking up, actually, let me try that again. Hold on. We can see that this row GUID is taking up most of the space. And so specifically, if we go back to transform, one of the things that makes AdventureWorks kind of goofy is they just throw in the kitchen sink. And one of those things is these globally unique IDs. And the problem is when it reaches from Power Query to DAX, it's trying to compress repeated values, right? Because when you're dealing with analytical data, your data is usually flattened out a little bit. You have a lot more repeated values because you're trying to do something called a star schema. And it uses something called run length encoding, which does a sorting and compresses the repeats. Well, if it's unique, there's no repeats. And it does something called dictionary encoding, where it says, okay, we're going to make a dictionary, and it's just going to be the number 1 for this value. So if I get rid of this, and here, like I said, there's no, I don't know why, but there's no gear icon for removed columns, but there is for removed other columns. Drives me nuts, right? So this is one of the situations where you might say, okay, I'm going to edit it here, or I'm going to go into the advanced editor, right? And I can change the name here, and it'll show up on the side there and all that kind of stuff. So I can close that, apply, it's gone, and I can refresh, and we'll see that it's no longer taking up most of the space. There was a question of when you remove columns, is that delete or just not seen? So it's functionally a delete. So what's going on is when you are in Power Query, it's asking, okay, what? All right, so actually, oh, that's one that's different. It's asking, okay, what data do we want to bring in? What do we want to do? And it's only going to bring in just the data you tell it, um, especially when you're doing import mode. Direct query is different. That's more of a live connection kind of situation. But for import mode, it's bringing in everything. And so if you delete, it's still there in the source system, right? So if I were to do SQL Server Management Studio, pull that up, we can pretty clearly see that I haven't harmed or changed the source system in any way, but it's being deleted from our data model. So it's no longer taking up space. It's no longer accessible to the user. Um, but the nice thing is if you decide, oh, I actually did want row GUID for some reason, you just click the little X and now it's back. And that is one of the things I really like about this. Do I have an undo? I do not. Let's go and get rid of that again. Sorry, I'm trying to pull up localhost at the same time. I really like that I can step through and see the changes. So if I go to something like this, I can filter and remove rows and add something custom, and I can see all of that. So it's very intuitive to follow along with. But like I said, if I take a look at the source table, we can see that that's all still there. Ugh. Um, right? So it's never going to affect the source system if you delete it in Power Query. It's just going to affect the DAX data model whenever it's loaded. Okay, real quick, let me show you what it kind of looks like in some of these other tools, right? So there was a question about Excel. So Excel is going to be a very similar experience. Um, the naming is really funny because it used to be that in Excel, you had to manually install these add-ins, but they became so popular, they just integrated them. So Power Pivot is still its own thing, but for Power Query, they just call it get data, just get and transform data. You can launch the Power Query editor, but what the experience usually looks like is something like this, right? Same idea. So again, I can say localhost, which just means my machine. And again, I can go to AdventureWorks here, pull in the sales order header. And again, I can decide, do I want to load or do I want to transform? Now, one of the things that's very confusing is we have load and load to, and I always get this wrong. So one of these loads it to the page and one of them loads it to the Power Pivot data model. So again, it's opening up its own window. So it's really important to think of Power Query as its own thing. This is a source of confusion otherwise. And again, just like before, we can say, okay, we want these columns. And I could do some other type of transformation. So I could decide, okay, I want to split this. So split column by delimiter. I tend to prefer just clicking on the column, but there's usually 2 or 3 ways to access whatever you want to do. We I guess there really isn't a delimiter in this case. Just for the sake of demonstration, we'll say that the delimiter is the letter O, and we just want to do the leftmost. Okay. And again, I can do view native. Apparently that split broke it. So you want to have those types of steps near the end. So now here's, again, where it gets kind of confusing. If you just do close and load, it's going to load it to the default destination, which in my experience is the page. But usually, in my experience, what you want is you want to do close and load to, and then you want to tell it, oh, I actually want to load it to the data model. So if you do that, then you can go to manage data model. So it's still going to like make a page here, right? But then you can go to Power Pivot, you can go to manage data model, and you get a similar experience as you would in Power BI, although I would say an inferior one, right? Just because if we're looking at here for being able to add measures, make changes, all this kind of stuff, this UI has not changed in a decade. This is the same UI that I was using in it was around like 2012 when it was first an add-in. It has not changed at all. Whereas, they're putting all their investments here, and it's just so much easier to navigate. It's so much easier to see what's going on. It's so much easier to add measures and that kind of stuff, right? So going back to that question, if you want the latest and greatest and you want the best UI for working with these tools, you want to use Power BI. But if you live in Excel and you're happy with pivot tables, then you can say close, and then I can go ahead and insert a pivot table. And now I can do my usual kind of stuff. I don't really, you get the idea. I didn't bring in the exact columns that we need. Any more questions before I show you real quick kind of fabric and some of that? Okay. So again, just to reiterate, should you use it, right? If you're living in Excel, you should look into it, because the thing that I love about Power Query is if I go back to the query editor, or even not there, I just do here, I can hit refresh and all of my data transformations happen again. I can reload the data. And so if you're doing any manual data cleanup in Excel, go out and buy Power Query for the low price of $0 today. Okay. So if you're doing manual cleanup, 100% absolutely. If you're not doing manual cleanup or not a lot, still worth looking to if you're in Excel. If you're living in Power BI, it's worth being familiar with. It is okay to do most of the work back in SQL Server. If you're experienced with that or you have support from the DBA team, there's many times where I will just use Power Query as just a data like little hose to connect to it, and I don't do any cleaning. But that assumes that you have all of that logic there. What you don't want to do is you don't want to mix and match too much of that. Specifically, if I say I want to get data from SQL Server and I go to advanced options and I type in my SQL statement, that's going to break query folding for everything after that, unless you do a very specific workaround that I'm not going to get into. And so unless you know exactly what you're doing, do not hand roll your own SQL, because you'll lose out on query folding. You'll lose out on those performance gains. So Excel, if you're doing stuff manually, start using Power Query today. If you're not, still look into it. Power BI, use it as needed, but I use it all the time. And so now let's talk about Fabric. So here I've got a workspace open in Fabric, and let's see. I want to go to Lakehouse. I think I want to go Lakehouse. I'm still learning Fabric. So one of the things that I find particularly interesting is there are a bunch of different ways that you can access data in Fabric. This can be both exciting and frustrating depending on where you're coming from, right? Because I think one of the default ways to do it is to do a data pipeline, which is, as far as I understand it, it's essentially Azure Data Factory or a variant thereof. And so I think if you have experience with that or you have a lot of resources in Azure, then I would get used to that, because I think it's going to be a little bit more fully featured. So here's an example of our data pipeline. If you're doing complex data transformations, I recommend using Python notebooks for this kind of stuff. But where I get excited is I can do data flows Gen 2. So what a data flow is, if you don't know, is it's just a little bit of Power Query that's on its own. Because normally when you upload a Power BI file, your data model is combined with the Power Query. It's like, okay, I've baked a cake and I put the icing on top. There's no separating it out, right? Whereas a data flow is like, just give me the chocolate chips or just give me part of the bake mix or something like that. And so what you'll notice is um, it's the same kind of experience, it's the same sort of kind of deal here. It all looks very similar. Do I have? Dun, dun, dun. Let me see. I can probably pull from the lake house. Lake house. Just because I don't have any like SharePoint files handy or anything like that. So let's see. Which one is likely to have stuff we can use? I think we'll pull from that one maybe. Maybe. Sorry, my tenant is just a mess of all these like test projects and learning projects and all that kind of stuff. There we go. One of the things you can see how much memory it has. One of the things I mentioned before is Power Query is not a very performant engine. It does a lot of tricks to push down work, but again, if performance is a key concern, then you may want to look at a different compute engine. But here I can go and say, okay, I want to pull data from my lakehouse. And now we're in the kind of user experience that I feel comfortable with, right? Like I could say, okay, I'm going to, I don't know why you would do this. Let's see how good it is at math. I'm gonna do, no, it's not gonna be able to figure that out. Sure. We'll do the square of petal length. The columns from examples is really nice when you're working with like text and that kind of stuff, but I could handwrite some code or something like that. But the point being that I can easily make my transformations, I can easily do my filters, and then I can publish. And if we go back, is it gonna, okay, it's running right now. Did I set a target? Sorry, as you can tell, I haven't done any customer work with Fabric just yet. But the thing that gets me excited is they really are trying to make, just in the same way that Power BI kind of democratized BI and reporting, they're trying to do the same thing with Fabric. And so you have this same UI available. You also have a UI for Visual SQL. And if you look at what it produces, it'll produce very similar stuff. Oh, it published. Did it? Let's see. Let's go back real quick. Come on. Maybe. Oh, it's going to the, no, I want to go to, that's from there, did it? All right, I'm not going to worry about that too much right now, but you get the idea. The other thing is, so with a lakehouse, just for those of you who don't know, it's a bunch of files in a data lake and then like a thin veneer of SQL on top, that sort of thing. So it's a lake first kind of approach. But one of the things that's interesting is they have a visual SQL kind of functionality. And if you look at the output, it looks suspiciously like what Power Query makes. And if you look at the UI, it looks suspiciously like Power Query. Um, and so I'm excited about Power Query in Fabric because I think it allows that user story of, okay, I'm comfortable with Power BI and I want to do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. But if I was coming over from the Databricks side, if I was coming over from like a Lake First, like or like Snowflake or something, I would not be particularly excited about Power Query in there. I don't think it's the best tool for the job. I think it's just one of the most accessible ones. Oh, did I click somewhere wrong? No. Okay, cool. So the iris data did come in. It just took a second to show up. So there's our little square number kind of thing. But we can do we could type out a SQL query against the SQL endpoint, or we could do a new visual query. And so we can bring, which one? Sure. So we can bring in a table and it'll take a second, but what you'll see is that we've got a very similar UI. It's not the same, right? It's very focused on SQL transformations. So come on, there's got to be more. Cool. So let's say I want to get rid of a couple of those. And then I want to group on that. Sure. Right. So for a business user, not too bad of an experience. And then I could save it as view. But if I do, again, if I do view SQL, wow, this sure looks very familiar, right? It's this ugly, ugly SQL code that's probably being generated, if I had to guess, by Power Query, or at least a similar engine. So those are kind of the three main places to think about with Power Query. It's also available in SQL Server Analysis Services if you're using that on-prem. I know years ago there was some sort of like module for SSIS. I don't know if that went anywhere. You can also use it in Power Automate if you're talking to a SQL Server backend. So quick question from Joe. When I do customer work, what do I mostly do in Power Query and Power BI? Yeah, so that's a great question. So generally the work that I'm doing is to get the data into a star schema shape. So usually a lot of times that's identifying what tables we actually need. A lot of times it's getting rid of columns we don't need. And then occasionally I may do some data transformations, especially around like dates or certain data types. Sometimes I might do things like binning if I need certain groups to filter on, but usually the actual business logic, like year over year sales, I will do in DAX. So the way that I like to think about the difference, if you could pay someone minimum wage for Power Query, then you're paying someone $50 an hour to actually understand the business in DAX. But generally, a lot of the work that I'm doing is getting into a star schema analytical kind of shape where you have a centralized transaction table and then a bunch of dimensions or lookups. And then just writing a lot of business measures that are usually around like, okay, how did we do this year compared to last year? How's this department doing compared to that department? All that kind of stuff. And then trying to make it look pretty, which is the hardest part for me. I'm a programmer at heart, but I get by. Um, but yeah, that's a great question. But like I said, sincerely, I love Power Query. I wish there was a tool to import data into SQL Server with Power Query because sometimes you have like an XML file or a JSON file or something gnarly or nested or ugly, and it's just great for that, right? Okay, cool. So we've got 5 more minutes. I think really covered all the demo stuff I wanted to cover. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm more than happy to talk about being a consultant. I can tell you about my dog. His name's Tyson. Um, anything at all. Otherwise, I'll give you guys, folks, back your 5 minutes for lunch. Joe had a question. What's the best way to learn DAX measures? Great question. So there are two books by Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari. And there's I recommend starting with the smaller one, but I find a book helps. I have a couple user group presentations on DAX as well. I also have a course on Pluralsight, which is my best performing course because everyone hates DAX. But the big thing is to understand that there's a bunch of mental model shifts that you have to learn, right? It is the most unintuitive language I've ever learned. And so that's something to really understand. Mike M asks if in Power Query, if you import from a folder, a number of sample queries are created. What are these sample queries and can they be deleted? So I'm 90% sure that the point of those sample queries is the UI needs something um, to show you what the transformations are going to look like. Um, the and That's the point of the sample query, so that you can see what the transformations looks like. I don't know off the top of my head if you can delete it. I've never done that. But that's my kind of understanding. Is otherwise it just doesn't work quite the way that you want. That said, there's been times where I've handwritten code to read from a folder, and that's worked fine, right? So they aren't required. They're a convenience thing because it creates a function that looks at the sample and then can loop through all of the stuff. Gabby has a question about how I made the leap. I've got plenty of blog posts about that on SQL Gene, but a lot of it was I started doing courses and I was making just enough money to pay the mortgage, and I didn't like my job, and so I decided to kind of take the leap. Um, I know there's plenty of content on LinkedIn Learning for Power BI. I have not watched a ton of it, so I can't really speak much to any of that. Um, there was a question about troubleshooting and performance tuning issues. So the biggest ones are, and I've got module one free on YouTube if you want to see some of the high level stuff. But the biggest ones are people break query folding. People try to use direct query and don't understand its limitations. People don't use a star schema. So if you have bidirectional filtering in many-to-many relationships, your performance is going to be awful, just 99% of the time. The customer project with Postgres that I just did, the issues where we were doing direct query and we had two many-to-many relationships, and we had high cardinality. So we had a lot of rows, and a lot of rows in your transaction table is fine. A lot of millions of rows in your dimension tables, not as much, especially if it has to make multiple hops because of the relationships or the many-to-many relationships. And then another one is just poor model size management. So I used a tool from Alberto Ferrari and Marco Russo called Bravo to see the size. The bigger your data model is, even if you're not using those columns, the worse the performance, right? And the more columns you have, the worse the compression, because it'll do a multi-sort. And so the first columns it sorts, the better the compression. The ones after that, it gets worse. So those are some of the most common kind of issues. I guess I should do just the mildest of self-promotion. Let me give everyone my link tree because I mentioned my blog and my YouTube. So give me 1 second here. So I've got a free module on performance tuning. I've got some on YouTube, some user group presentations on DAX. So yeah, definitely check it out. And thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time, Eugene. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and we'll post the recording on the YouTube channel once
Yeah,
it's processed. And once again, Eugene, appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time.
you're all very welcome.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Have a great day. Bye.